The transport ship smelled like chalk dust and packed lunches. 15 children from Westfield Academy had been sitting in the passenger hold for 2 hours, pressed against the oval windows, watching asteroids drift past like slow gray ghosts. Their teacher, a man named Rao, had promised them that the outer rim transit would be the most exciting part of the trip. He had been right, though not in the way he intended. The ship was called the Linden Cross. It was a civilian vessel, old and reliable, the kind that carried families and small cargo and school groups to observation stations near the edge of mapped human space. It had no weapons. It had no military markings. What it did have was a cracked registration beacon that had been transmitting a corrupted signal for the past 3 weeks, something the school board's transport contractor had not bothered to fix. That corrupted signal was what the Dravosi patrol picked up. 3 angular ships came out of the dark fast, their hulls the color of iron, their running lights cold blue. They surrounded the Linden Cross in a triangle formation and held it there with tractor fields before anyone on board had time to understand what was happening. Rao was at the front of the hold explaining the asteroid density charts when the lights flickered and the ship shuddered to a stop. One of the children, a girl named Nadia, looked out the window and said very calmly that there were alien ships outside. Everyone pressed against the windows at once. The Dravosi were a species built around order. Their patrol divisions operated under a code that was 700 years old and had not been meaningfully updated in 200. When they detected a vessel transmitting a corrupted beacon in a monitored sector, the procedure was clear: board, detain, process. The code did not have a section for school trips. 4 officers came through the docking collar in full enforcement armor. The armor was black and rigid, built for beings who stood over 2 meters tall, with wide flat shoulders and gray skin that looked like cooled stone. Their visors were dark blue, and they moved in formation without speaking, which Rao later described as the most frightening thing he had ever seen. Rao stepped forward immediately, hands raised, and began explaining. He had clearance documents on his data pad. He had the school's travel permit. He had the children's parental consent forms, the itinerary, the contact details for Westfield Academy's administration office. He held all of it out toward the lead officer, a broad-shouldered Dravosi named Drev, who looked at the documents and then looked at the 15 small humans behind Rao and did not move. The problem was translation. The Linden Cross had a basic translation unit, but it was calibrated for trade dialogue, not enforcement terminology. When Rao said the word students, it came out in Dravosi as something closer to unregistered small civilians, which was not helpful. Drev ran a scan. The scan confirmed 15 human life signs under the age of legal majority, 1 adult human, a civilian vessel with a corrupted beacon, and no registered flight manifest on the Dravosi patrol database. Under the 700-year-old code, the correct action was to detain all occupants and transport them to the nearest processing facility for identification and clearance. Drev began that process. Rao kept talking. He was not a man who panicked easily, but his voice was getting higher. He asked to contact the human embassy. He asked for a delay. He asked twice if Drev understood that these were children. The translation unit rendered children as small noncombatants, which Drev acknowledged and filed under the detainee category without further consideration. The children watched all of this with varying expressions. A boy named Sarin stood very still near the back and looked at every door and corridor the officers came through, memorizing the path. A smaller boy named Pip tugged on Nadia's sleeve and whispered that the tall gray aliens looked like the stone figures in the museum on level 4 of the Eastport Gallery. Nadia told him to be quiet and pay attention. They were separated at the docking transfer. Rao was taken down a different corridor, still talking, his data pad still extended. The children were moved as a group into a wide transfer hold and then into a processing bay where a Dravosi clerk scanned each of them in turn, assigned them a detainee number, and logged them into the facility intake system. The clerk worked quickly and did not look at them much. She entered their age ranges into the system. The system accepted the data without flagging anything unusual, because the system was also 700 years old and had been designed for a galaxy that did not yet include humans. The children were taken to the holding block. It was a long gray corridor with large cells on either side, built for beings considerably bigger than a 12-year-old. The energy barriers hummed faintly. The lights were cold and blue-white. Somewhere deeper in the block, something large made a low sound that echoed off the walls. Nadia looked at the cell they were directed into. It was easily large enough for all 15 of them. There were flat sleeping platforms and a water dispensing unit and nothing else. She walked in first. The others followed. Pip immediately climbed onto the highest sleeping platform to see if he could touch the ceiling. He could not, but he kept trying. Rao, alone in a small room 3 corridors away, put his face in his hands for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood up and started knocking on the energy barrier and asking very loudly to speak to someone in charge. Nobody came for a while. In the holding block, Nadia counted the children twice, confirmed everyone was present, and then sat down and began thinking. The first thing Nadia did was take everyone's names. Not because she did not know them. She had been in the same class as most of them for 2 years. She did it because it gave the younger ones something to respond to, something normal to hold onto while the blue-white lights hummed above them, and the unfamiliar sounds of the detention block pressed in from every direction. She called each name. Each child answered. Some quietly, some loudly, one girl named Preet with a wobble in her voice that she covered by clearing her throat immediately after. "Good," Nadia said. "Everyone is here. That is the first thing." Soren had been walking the perimeter of the cell since they arrived. It was large, built for something much bigger than a human child, with walls of smooth, dark composite and a ceiling that went up nearly 5 meters. The sleeping platforms were wide, flat slabs that could have fit 3 adults each. He had already counted the platforms, the distance to the energy barrier, the number of lights overhead, and the approximate thickness of the walls based on how sound moved through them. He reported his findings to Nadia in a low voice. 1 exit. The barrier pulses every 4 seconds, which means it is active but not at full draw. There is a ventilation shaft in the upper left corner, too small to fit through, even for Pip. Pip looked disappointed when he heard that last part. The second thing Nadia did was food. She had the group pool whatever they had brought on the trip. 12 snack packs, 3 water bottles, a container of dried fruit that belonged to a boy named Davy, and a wrapped sandwich that a girl named Ussel had been saving for the observation station. Nobody argued about sharing. Nadia divided everything into equal portions and told them they would eat in 2 rounds, the younger children first. A boy named Cass, who was 9 and had been very quiet since boarding, asked if they were in serious trouble. Nadia thought about the question honestly. Then she said that Rao was somewhere in the facility making a great deal of noise on their behalf, and that she expected the situation would be sorted out, though she could not say exactly when. Cass accepted this and ate his portion of dried fruit. By the second hour, the children had made significant improvements to the cell. The sleeping platforms had been rearranged as best they could manage, pushed closer together so the younger children were not isolated. Someone had found that the water unit produced not just water but a warm mineral liquid that tasted faintly of something nobody could identify but which was not unpleasant. Pip had claimed the highest platform as his personal observation post and was lying on his stomach watching the corridor. It was Pip who noticed the guard first. The guard's name, as they later found out, was Gora. He was a young Dravosi, broad and gray-skinned like the officers who had boarded the ship, but his armor was a lighter gray that marked him as a lower-ranking facility worker rather than a patrol enforcer. He had been assigned to monitor the corridor, and was doing so with the dedicated stillness of someone trying very hard not to look at the strange, small detainees in the oversized cell. Pip slid off the platform, crossed to the barrier, and stared at Gora with open and completely unself-conscious curiosity. Gora did not react. Pip asked in a clear voice what the marks on Gora's armor meant. Gora said nothing. The translation unit on his belt rendered Pip's question correctly. Gora understood it. He chose not to answer. Pip pointed at a specific set of markings on the chest plate and tilted his head. "Those ones," he said. "They look like the navigation symbols from the charts Rao showed us, except rotated." Gora looked down at his own chest. The markings were patrol sector designations. They did in fact bear a structural resemblance to certain navigational grid symbols used in standard human cartographic systems, though for entirely different reasons having to do with the underlying mathematics of spatial division being similar across species. Gora said very quietly that they were sector marks. Pip lit up entirely. Over the next 40 minutes, Pip learned 6 Dravosi words, taught Gora the rules of a card game using a battered deck he had in his jacket pocket, and found out that the low sound coming from deeper in the block was made by a large reptilian detainee who snored. Gora answered questions with increasing frequency and decreasing awareness that he was doing so. Meanwhile, Nadia had organized a song. It started as a way to keep the younger children calm and became something else entirely. 15 human children singing together in a 5-meter ceiling stone corridor produced a sound that traveled far. It bounced off walls. It moved through ventilation shafts. It reached the other cells in the block where the actual criminal detainees of various species had been sitting in professional silence. A 7-limbed creature, 3 cells down, pressed itself against its barrier and made a sound of distress. A large-scaled being in the cell opposite turned its entire body to face away. A Dravosi career criminal who had broken 11 laws across 4 systems and feared almost nothing sat very still and waited for the sound to stop. It did not stop for quite some time. Back in his holding room, Rao heard the distant echo of the singing and put his forehead against the cool wall and breathed slowly. He was still asking to speak to someone in charge. A different clerk had come twice. He had explained the situation both times with full documentation. Both times the clerk had logged his request and left. The singing continued. In the cell, Soren had produced a flat piece of food packaging and was quietly drawing a map of everything he had observed so far. He was being thorough. The report was filed at the end of the second shift. It was a standard intake summary, the kind the Dravosi processing clerks produced hundreds of each day across their network of border facilities. Detainee count, species, age range, reason for detention, vessel details, assigned holding block. The clerk who filed it was named Asa. She was efficient and careful and had been doing this work for 11 years without incident. She submitted the report to the Central Galactic Tribunal Relay at the same time as 40 other routine documents from the facility. It joined a queue. It sat in the queue for several hours. Then a junior aide at the tribunal sorting office in the Myrathi Administrative District opened the batch, began reviewing documents, and stopped. His name was Fen. He was young, barely 3 years into his posting, and he had a habit of reading intake reports more carefully than his seniors thought was necessary. He read the Linden Cross detainee summary twice. Then he read it a third time. 15 human detainees, ages 9 to 13 standard years. He looked at that line for a long time. Fen knew enough about humans to understand what those ages meant. He knew that human children were considered a protected class under almost every piece of legislation the Galactic Tribunal had ever passed regarding civilian welfare. He knew that humans, as a species, had a response to threats against their young that was documented in the xenobiology files under the heading Extreme Protective Behavior, which was one of the more careful phrasings the tribunal had ever used for something that was, in practical terms, catastrophic. He flagged the document as priority and walked it personally to the office of Counselor Ven. Ven was a Myrathi, tall and pale-robed, with 4 arms and a face that had spent 40 years learning to show nothing. She had overseen diplomatic disputes between 12 species. She had mediated a resource war. She had once sat in a room while 2 different alien ambassadors threatened each other with actions that would have destroyed inhabited planets, and she had not blinked. She read Fenn's flagged report and blinked. Then she read it again. She set it down on her desk and looked at the far wall for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she needed to contact the human embassy immediately. The human embassy occupied a wide building on the 3rd ring of the tribunal station. Ambassador Priya was in a meeting about agricultural trade permits when the call came through on her priority channel. She excused herself, stepped into a side room, and answered. Ven delivered the information directly. There was no gentle way to frame it, so she did not try. A Dravosi patrol facility had been holding 15 human children for approximately 6 hours. They had been processed as standard civilian detainees. They were physically unharmed. The situation had only just been identified at the tribunal level. There was a silence on the line. Ven waited. She had dealt with human diplomats before, and she had learned that silence from a human was not nothing. It was almost always something. Priya said, in a voice that was completely level, that she understood. She asked for the facility location. She asked for the names of the processing officers involved. She asked for the current status of the children's teacher, a man named Rao. She asked all of these questions in the same tone someone might use to confirm a meeting time. Ven answered each one. Then she said that she was deeply sorry and that the tribunal was already preparing a formal inquiry. Priya said that was good. Then she thanked Ven, ended the call, and walked back into her meeting. She sat down. She picked up her data pad. She looked at the trade permit documents in front of her for approximately 3 seconds. Then she told her assistant to clear her schedule, contact the Embassy Transport Division, and get her a secure line to the Westfield Academy Parent Emergency Network. What happened next was not something the Dravosi High Command had anticipated, because they had not yet been informed there was a problem. The report had been filed correctly by Dravosi standards. The children were unharmed. The processing had followed protocol. As far as the Dravosi Facility Administration knew, they had 15 small human civilian detainees awaiting clearance, same as any other unverified occupants of a vessel with a corrupted beacon. The first indication that something was wrong came from the Galactic Comnet. A junior communications officer at the tribunal noticed a spike in encrypted message traffic originating from human embassy channels and routing toward 4 different human residential and commercial stations. The spike was not unusual in volume. It was unusual in that every message had been marked with the same internal priority code, one the Tribunal Communications Office had only ever seen used twice before. The code translated roughly as, "Our people are in danger, we are moving." The officer flagged it for his supervisor. His supervisor looked at the flag, looked at the destination stations, looked at the volume of outgoing messages, and went directly to find Counselor Ven. Ven was already at her desk composing a formal demand to Dravosi High Command for immediate release of the detainees. She added a second section to the document asking them to prepare a full account of the incident for tribunal review. Then she sent it. She also, quietly and without making it an official action, sent a personal note to the Dravosi facility commander. It was short. It said that the situation had been identified and that speed of resolution would be a significant factor in how the tribunal viewed the matter going forward. She sent that one at a higher priority than the official document. Then she waited. On the tribunal station, in the small office where Fenn had first read the intake report, the young aide pulled up the human embassy traffic logs and watched the numbers climb. He did not know exactly what a human parent emergency network was, but the data in front of him made him think it was probably not something the Dravosi facility was prepared for. He was not wrong. The Galactic Comnet was not designed to carry outrage efficiently, but it managed. By the time the Dravosi High Command received Counselor Ven's formal demand, the intake report had already been copied and forwarded 11 times through back channels connecting tribunal staff, embassy networks, and the cultural liaison offices of 8 different species. By the time the High Command's senior legal officer had read the demand and begun drafting a response, the information had reached the Oracy Trade Delegation, the Mirathi Academic Council, and a very well-connected Pelhari journalist who covered interstellar affairs from a station 3 sectors away. The Pelhari published first. The headline read, "Dravosi Patrol detains 15 human children for 6 hours, classifies them as standard criminal detainees." Within 2 hours it had been republished on 14 secondary networks. Within 4 hours, the Tribunal's General Communications Office had received formal expressions of concern from 6 species. Within 6 hours, that number was 19. The Dravosi High Command issued a statement. It was precise, technically accurate, and catastrophically misjudged. It explained that the detention had followed correct protocol for vessels transmitting corrupted identification signals, that the detainees had been treated according to standard facility guidelines, and that the matter was under review. The response from the Oracy ambassador was one sentence. It said, "They were children." The response from the Mirathi Cultural Office was longer but conveyed the same point. The Pelhari journalist wrote a second piece. The Alundi species, who had no formal relationship with humans but had extensive documentation on human child development from research exchanges, submitted a 17-page brief to the tribunal explaining in biological and psychological detail exactly what human children were, and why placing them in an adult criminal detention block was something that should never happen under any protocol, updated or otherwise. The Dravosi legal team read the Alundi brief and began having internal conversations about protocol review. The facility commander, a Dravosi officer named Breath who had run the station for 9 years and had never had a diplomatic incident, received 11 communications in one morning. He read them in order, then read them again, then called his operations officer and asked whether the human detainees in Block 7 were still unharmed. The operations officer checked and confirmed they were. She also reported, somewhat uncertainly, that the human children had taught 3 guards a card game, had reorganized their cell furniture in a way that violated no regulations but that nobody had anticipated, and had been producing a significant amount of noise in the form of what appeared to be communal vocal performance. Breath asked what communal vocal performance meant. "Singing," said the operations officer. "They have been doing it periodically since the 2nd hour of detention. The criminal detainee in cell 11 has filed 3 complaints." Breath looked at the 11 communications waiting on his desk, and then looked at his operations officer for a long time without speaking. Meanwhile, inside the holding block, the children had developed a functional routine. Nadia ran a schedule. Morning window, which was what she called the first period after lights shifted to a slightly warmer tone, was for movement. The younger children did stretches and simple exercises because she had read once that the body needed to move, and there was no reason to stop doing sensible things just because the situation was unusual. Then came what she called learning time, which was Soren explaining whatever he had observed about the facility's systems, and Pip reporting on whatever he had managed to get Gora to say. Pip's vocabulary in Dravosi had grown to 31 words. He had also learned that Gora had been in the patrol service for 2 years, had a family in the Outer Ring residential sector, and that the card game Pip had taught him was considered deeply entertaining by two other guards who had heard about it from Gora and come by to observe from a discreet distance. On the second day, Pip organized a small tournament. 6 Dravosi guards stood in the corridor watching through the barrier while 3 children played cards on a sleeping platform. Nobody in the facility could fully explain how this had happened. It had simply developed in the way that Pip things tended to develop, which was organically and without asking permission. The largest guard, a veteran named Sav who had been with the facility for 15 years, and who other detainees found intimidating enough that they did not speak in his presence, watched Pip confidently play his hand and say something that required 6 words of Dravosi he had learned that morning. Sav made a sound that no one initially recognized because it was not something Dravosi did frequently in professional settings. He was laughing. None of the children seemed to think this was remarkable. Back on the tribunal station, Ven had received word from the Embassy Transport Division that 3 civilian vessels had departed human-controlled space and were moving toward the facility. She checked the registry. All 3 were listed as private transport. None were military. None were armed. She told Fen to keep monitoring. Fen pulled up the passenger manifests that had been filed with the Transit Authority. He went through them carefully. Then he looked at Ven and said, in a quiet voice, that the passengers appeared to be parents. Ven closed her eyes briefly. She thought about the Dravosi facility commander, about the formal protocol review that was already being drafted, about the 19 species who had filed expressions of concern, about the Alundi brief, about the legal team's internal conversations. Then she thought about 3 civilian ships full of human parents currently crossing open space toward a Dravosi detention facility, and she decided that speed of resolution was no longer just a factor in how the tribunal viewed the matter. It was a matter of galactic stability. She sent a second note to Breath. This one was shorter than the first. It said, "They are coming." The 3 ships landed without ceremony. They came in on standard approach vectors, filed correct docking requests, and touched down on the facility's outer platform in a neat row. No alarms were triggered. No regulations were violated. The Dravosi dock control officer cleared them through with mild confusion because civilian vessels arriving at a border detention facility was unusual but not technically prohibited. Then the ramps came down. 37 human adults walked out into the pale light of the outer rim. They were not in uniform. They carried no weapons. They had bags on their shoulders, data pads in their hands, and the kind of expressions that made the 2 dock guards standing nearby take a slow step backward without consciously deciding to. Ambassador Priya led them. She walked at the front of the group with her diplomatic credentials visible on her jacket and her pace measured and unhurried, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had been running. Behind her came parents, a woman who was a construction engineer, a man who fixed reactor systems for a living, a retired nurse, a secondary school librarian, a freight hauler. Ordinary people, entirely ordinary, except for the fact that each of them had received a message 2 days ago telling them their child was in a detention facility, and they had been on a ship within the hour. The dock guards sent an alert to Commander Breath. Breath met them in the outer reception hall with his operations officer and 2 legal staff members. He had prepared a formal statement. He had the documentation ready showing that all protocol had been followed. He was going to explain the situation clearly and professionally. Priya let him begin. She stood very still while he spoke, and she did not interrupt him once. This was the first thing that unsettled Breath, because he had expected interruptions. Her eyes tracked each point he made. Her expression was perfectly neutral. Behind her, 36 parents also stood quietly, which was the second thing that unsettled him, because 36 humans being silent in a small room was not something Dravosi legal briefings had ever prepared him for. When Breath finished, Priya said that she understood. She said it without any particular emphasis on any word, which meant the sentence could be interpreted in several ways, none of them fully comfortable. Then she said that she would need to see the children within the next 30 minutes. That she would need Rao released immediately and present for the reunion, and that she would be recording the full interaction on behalf of the human embassy for tribunal review. She said all of this in the tone of someone listing items on a shopping list. Breath's legal officer leaned over and said, very quietly, that there was no legal basis to deny any of those requests. Breath told his operations officer to begin the release process. It took 22 minutes. The children were brought through 2 corridors from the holding block to a wide reception room that was normally used for approved visitor meetings. They arrived in a group, walking together, Nadia at the front, Soren slightly to the side taking in the new environment, Pip at the back still wearing the patrol badge. He had talked Gora into letting him keep on the grounds that it was very interesting, and he wanted to show his parents. Rao came through a different door at almost exactly the same time. He stopped when he saw the children. He did a quick count. Then he did it again. His shoulders dropped by about 3 centimeters, and he let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 days. The children saw him, and the room changed. It was not a dramatic change. Nobody screamed or ran. But the careful composure that Nadia had held together for 48 hours relaxed all at once, and she crossed the room quickly, and Rao met her halfway and put his hand on her shoulder and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, that he was sorry it took so long. She said it was all right. Then she told him about the card tournament and Gora, and the map Soren had made, and the singing, and the warm mineral water that tasted like something they could not identify. Rao listened to all of it. His expression moved through several things in quick succession. Then the parents came in. The 37 adults from the ships had been waiting in the corridor, and now they moved into the room, and it was no longer a formal diplomatic environment in any meaningful sense. A man dropped to his knees to hug a small girl. A woman pressed her face into her son's hair. Pip's mother found him immediately because he was the one still wearing a foreign patrol badge and attempting to explain to his father, in real time, that Gora had technically given it to him voluntarily. Priya did not participate in any of this. She stood near the door with her data pad, documenting everything, watching the room with an expression that was not quite neutral anymore. Gora was standing in the corridor outside, technically still on duty, technically looking at the wall in front of him. When Pip came back through the door briefly to wave at him, Gora raised one large gray hand and waved back. Pip grinned and went back to his parents. Commander Breath stood in the far corner of the reception room and watched what was happening in the way that someone watches a thing they cannot fully categorize. His operations officer came to stand beside him. She said quietly that the children had not appeared distressed during the detention. Breath said he was aware. She said that, in fact, several of his guards had voluntarily extended their monitoring shift to remain near the holding block during the card tournament. Breath did not respond to that. She said, after a pause, that she thought the protocol review was probably a good idea. Breath agreed that it probably was. Priya caught his eye from across the room. She gave him a single, brief, precisely calibrated nod. It was not warm. It was not hostile. It was the kind of nod that communicated, without any words at all, that she was taking careful note of how this resolution had proceeded, and that this was not the end of the matter, only the end of this part of it. Breath nodded back. It was the most uncomfortable nod of his professional life. The Galactic Tribunal convened a formal session 11 days after the children came home. The chamber was large and tiered, designed so that every representative could see every other representative, which was useful when the thing being discussed required everyone to witness each other's reactions. It was the kind of room built for moments that mattered. Counselor Ven had used it perhaps 30 times in her career. She had never used it for something that had started with a corrupted beacon on a school transport ship. The Dravosi sent 3 representatives. They arrived in full formal dress, prepared with documentation, ready to defend the protocol that had been followed. The lead representative, a senior legal officer named Var, had prepared a detailed presentation. He had expected a difficult session. He was right about that, though not about the shape of it. Ven opened the session and gave the floor to Ambassador Priya first. Priya's presentation lasted 24 minutes. It was factual, sequential, and entirely without emotional language. She described the initial boarding, the processing, the assignment of detainee numbers to children aged 9 to 13, the 48 hours of detention, and the conditions of the holding block. She presented Rao's recorded requests for communication with the embassy, timestamped, which showed that he had asked 18 times across 2 days and received no response until after the tribunal had already been alerted. She presented Soren's hand-drawn map of the facility, which she noted had been produced from memory by an 11-year-old boy during detention, because he was the kind of child who needed to understand his environment to feel safe. She presented it without comment. She let it sit on the holographic display in the center of the chamber for 12 seconds. Several of the representatives looked at that map for the full 12 seconds. Then she sat down. Var gave his presentation. He was thorough and precise, and he explained the 700-year protocol correctly in every detail. He explained that the corrupted beacon had triggered a mandatory response, that the detainees had been processed according to standard guidelines, that no physical harm had occurred. The Oracy representative asked whether the 700-year protocol contained any provision for identifying beings under the age of legal majority, before classifying them as standard civilian detainees. Var said it did not. The Mirathi academic representative asked whether the Dravosi processing system had flagged the detainees' ages at any point during intake. Var said the system had logged the age range. It had not generated an alert because it had not been programmed to. The Alundi representative said, in the quiet and deliberate tone the Alundi used for things they considered obvious, that a system which logged the ages of children and did not then alert anyone was a system with a design problem. Nobody disagreed with that. The session ran for 4 hours. At the end, Ven read the tribunal's findings. The Dravosi patrol had not acted with malice. The Dravosi facility had not mistreated the children in any physical sense. Both of these things were noted and were not disputed. They were also, Ven said carefully, not the point. The point was that a gap in understanding had produced a situation which, had the children been of a different temperament, could have caused lasting psychological harm to minors in a facility they were never meant to occupy. The tribunal did not deal in what might have been, but it dealt very seriously in the conditions that created the possibility. The findings were as follows. The Dravosi Patrol and Detention Services would undergo a full xenocultural review. All intake systems across Dravosi-operated facilities would be updated within 6 months to flag beings under the age of legal majority for immediate specialist review. The patrol officers involved would complete a cultural briefing course on human developmental biology and the legal protections afforded to human minors under Galactic Tribunal Code. Commander Breath and Officer Drev would each submit formal written acknowledgments to the tribunal, to the human embassy, and to Rao personally. And the Dravosi High Command would issue a public statement on all registered Galactic Comnet channels, acknowledging the incident and confirming the corrective measures. Var accepted the findings without challenge. He had expected worse. Ven suspected he knew it could have been. 3 weeks later, a Galactic Comnet documentary team reached the children. It had taken that long because Priya had insisted on a waiting period, and the parents had agreed. The crew was small, a Pelhari producer, and two Mirathi camera operators who found human environments visually interesting and kept filming things like door handles and food packaging while they were supposed to be setting up. The interviews were conducted in Nadia's family's living room. Nadia sat with her hands folded and gave a measured account of the 2 days. She described the organization of the food rations, the schedule she had set, the way she had kept count of the children twice a day. The Pelhari producer asked if she had been frightened. Nadia thought about it for a moment and said that she had been focused, which was not quite the same thing. Soren sat at the kitchen table and unfolded his hand-drawn facility map for the camera. He explained each section carefully. The camera operator filmed it for longer than any other single image in the documentary. A later reviewer noted that the detail accuracy was approximately 83% compared to the actual facility schematics, which the tribunal had provided for fact-checking. Soren was 11. Pip was filmed last. He had the patrol badge pinned to his jacket. He was cheerful and expansive and talked for 20 minutes without being asked a question, covering the card game, Gora's sector marks, the name of the snoring creature in the block, and the mineral water that tasted like something nobody could identify. The camera operator asked, near the end, if Pip would go back to the outer rim again. Pip said absolutely, yes, as soon as possible, and that next time he wanted to learn more Dravosi because 31 words was not nearly enough. The documentary aired on 14 networks. On a Dravosi facility in the outer sector, a guard named Gora watched it in the staff room with 4 colleagues. When Pip appeared on screen wearing the patrol badge and grinning, one of the colleagues asked Gora if that was the same badge from the card tournament. Gora said yes. His colleague said nothing for a moment. Then she said that the human child had apparently kept it this whole time. Gora said yes, he knew. He was smiling when he said it, which was unusual enough that his colleagues talked about it for the rest of the shift. In the tribunal chamber, Counselor Venn filed the last document in the case and closed the record. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office and thought about Soren's map and Pip's 31 words and the card tournament that had materialized inside a criminal detention block, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She thought that the galaxy kept underestimating humans, and that the galaxy kept being surprised by this, and that neither of those things showed any sign of changing. She closed the file and moved on to the next one.